Hey, here are 5 stupid things I've noticed about World War II. It was the good war. Even with the benefit of 70 years of separation and perspective, World War II is still commonly perceived as a good war, a noble war. We, the non-German, non-Italian white people, were the good guys, and they, the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan, were the bad guys. Even though over 400,000 Americans were killed in the war, the image of the war in American culture is overwhelmingly positive. It was the war of G.I. Joe and Rosie the Riveter, the inspiring leadership of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the valor of the troops at Iwo Jima and Omaha Beach. In reality, of course, the Second World War was quite a bit more complicated than the patriotic comic strip version of the good war. For one thing, it was the most destructive war ever. During his excellent 14-hour documentary series, The War, Ken Burns makes this point early and often. World War II was not a good war. It was the worst war in history. For 6 years, throughout Europe, Africa, Asia, the Pacific, entire cities were bombed into rubble. Between 50 million and 80 million people were killed. 6 million of those deaths were the result of a campaign of institutionalized genocide carried out against Jews by Nazi Germany. Another 5 million to 10 million, mostly Romani, Slavs, homosexuals, members of other groups determined to be undesirable, were also killed as the result of Nazi policies. And most of this occurred a comfortable distance from the United States. The bombed out cities and death camps were located on the far side of an ocean, which probably accounts for why we Americans, who take to self-pity and martyrdom just as easily as we take to heroism and national pride, tend to regard the war as a boon rather than a catastrophe. Which is not to say that we Americans escaped the ugliness of the war entirely. After all, let us not forget our bigoted war propaganda. The various media intended to turn Americans against the Germans got pretty nasty at times, but it was nothing compared to that which targeted the Japanese. Case in point, this happy-looking fellow over here. He goes by the handle Tokyo Kid, and as you may have noticed, he is a somewhat offensive caricature of a Japanese person. Racist and dehumanizing depictions of the Japanese were justified at the time as being necessary to energize the war effort. Really? Even during the good war? All I can say is, I'm glad that we don't slur and vilify our enemies like this anymore. Bigoted internment of American citizens. Once you've conditioned people to view the Japanese as something less than human, it becomes a lot easier to round them all up and put them in camps for most of the war, which is exactly what the U.S. government did to over 120,000 Americans whose only crime was sharing the same ethnicity as our enemies. Almost all of those relocated were Japanese, but about 15,000 were German or Italian as well. All in all, the wartime internment of Americans was the worst injustice ever committed by the U.S. government against people in this country after it got out of the slave-holding and Indian-killing businesses. Maybe. It spawned the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. The post-war years were not all bad. They saw the coming of the United Nations, the UK's National Health Service, the space programs of the United States and the Soviets, just to name a few examples. But they also saw decades of political and military tension between the democratic First World and the communist Second World, which led to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and at several points nearly led to global nuclear war. The tension and fear and paranoia of the Cold War eventually resulted in the US and USSR stockpiling a total of 20,000 nuclear warheads between them by the early 1980s. As devastating as World War II was, it was its aftermath that nearly destroyed us. And still might. You never know. The hardest part is only picking 5. Catch you next time.